So yes, we think the theme's really relevant for a lot of us, and we've got some excellent speakers who are joining us today. Ewan and Stuart, who are both at Exeter University. So you might be able to see them in your screen there. So they are in a social bubble, which is why they're together.
Just to clarify that, yeah.
So I've got a little bit of a blurb about you both, which I'll run through relatively quickly before we let you dive in. So we've got Dr. Ewan Woodley. So he's a geographer working at the Nexus of Physical and Human Geography, with research interests in the engagement of publics with climate and environmental issues, so particularly around the areas of environmental risk and resilience. And Ewan also teaches at all stages of the degree programmes at Exeter on a wide variety of modules, including research methodologies and research design. And we've also got with us, we've got Professor Stuart Barr. So he's a human geographer, so with expertise in pro-environmental behavioural change and behavioural change policy and governance research. And his research has recently focused on sustainability mobilities and knowledge co-production to promote community resilience to climate change. So again, Stuart teaches across a range of both undergraduate and postgraduate level geography modules, and is also just ended a 3-year period of Geography's Director of Education, and has also previously directed the BA Geography programme and MSc in Sustainable Development. So I think you'll agree, both very well qualified to help shed some light and some thoughts on this approach to teaching at the Nexus of Human and Physical Geography. So if you do have any questions, as Neil mentioned earlier, if you put them in the chat function, and we'll put them to Ewan and Stuart towards the end of the talk. They're going to talk for around about half an hour or so, and then we'll have around about half an hour to have a discussion afterwards. Okay, so I'll leave it there from me, and I'll hand over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Ali, and for the introductions, and to Ali and Neil for setting this up. I'm glad they're in charge of the technology, so thank you both for doing that. It's lovely to have so many people join us today, and I know that some people have already submitted some questions, which we will definitely address at the end. And as Ali said, if you've got any issues that you want to raise, just put them in the chat, and Ali will be looking at those, and she'll ask us to address those when we've kind of finished talking in about half an hour's time. We're here really to talk about something that we're all very passionate about. I think if we're on this call, we're passionate about teaching at the kind of nexus of human and physical geography, the interface of the sciences and the social sciences, arts and humanities. I have to say that I always aspired to do this, but it wasn't until Ewan arrived at the university in 2011 that I actually got round to doing it. And one of the points I think we want to make today is that actually one of the things we need to think about is how you can actually be supported in your aspirations to teach at the nexus of human and physical geography. And actually one of the ways of doing that is to find like-minded people in your department, somebody who's on another part of the discipline who may want to do a module collaboratively with you. And that's certainly the way it worked for me, because I thought I'd love to actually be involved in more physical geography teaching, but I'm not a physical geographer, and so I don't really know how to do that. So I kind of came to this relatively late in my career, but I think it's been really rewarding, and I know there's lots of colleagues I speak to at Exeter who find teaching at the kind of nexus of human and physical really rewarding, because it gets to the heart of what kind of the environmental component of geography is about. So Ali has very kindly introduced us, so Ewan and I don't really need to say too much about ourselves. Thank you very much for now. So, but what we do want to do today is firstly to ask you to write some things in the chat in a moment about the opportunities and challenges of what we think teaching at the interface of human and physical geography, what those challenges and opportunities may be. We'll say something about the modules that we're going to use as the background to the discussion we're going to have today. We have taken a particular perspective on teaching human and physical geography together, and that may not be the one that you would want to take because you may be working in entirely different areas to us, so it might be useful for us just to set the context. And then we're going to kind of walk you through a journey about, well, if you wanted to do this stuff, how do you get started? I think we both argue that this is very much an organic process. I'm going to use a phrase later. It's definitely evolution, not revolution. I think I'd have been very unpopular in my department if I'd have just said, we're going to do all these things tomorrow, and that's the way it's going to be. I think we have to recognize the kind of the setting in which we're working. Thinking if we do want to start something, what the learning outcomes and the ethos behind a module or modules that we might want to develop might be. And then thinking about the module design principles, how it's going to be structured. I think we both argue that these kind of modules at the nexus of human and physical, we have to structure them in a different way than we might do a traditional subdiscipline module, because actually we need to support students a lot more, and we need to make what they're learning accessible. If we are looking at the social science of risk, we may need to do things for physical geography students to make it more accessible for them than we might do if they were advanced human geography students only. A lot of what we do is group working, and we've been thinking a lot at Exeter recently about group working and how we can make that accessible and inclusive, and also how critically we can resolve conflict, which can emerge when you have quite different perspectives within a group and you're asking students to work together who may have had quite different training experiences. And then finally, thinking about assessments. I think it's fair to say we've been through various different rounds of the ways that we've tried to assess students on the modules that we're involved with. We've done coursework, we've done exams, we're now on practical exams, which Ewan will explain in a moment. And that is evolving, because I think the more we learn about how students work together, the more I think we're interested in how we can use group work as a way of assessing students' abilities to come together and collaborate across the physical human boundary. And in many cases, they actually quite enjoy getting credit for doing that, even though generally group work is often something that our students certainly are less keen on. And then we'll have some time for a discussion. So that's what we're going to do. To get us started, we're going to give you a minute to type something in the chat, and we'd just like you to respond with a word or a short phrase that firstly is what you think the key opportunity for interdisciplinary teaching on the environment in geography is for you, and then what you think the key challenge for you is about teaching in an interdisciplinary way about the environment in geography. So what do you regard as the key opportunity for you, and what do you regard as the key challenge? And Ali will kindly kind of pick some of those up for us towards the end. So we won't look at the feedback now, we'll do that towards the end. So we'll give you about a minute to type something in the chat, and then I will hand over to Ewan. And just whilst you're doing that, just to say that the images we've put on the presentation today are actually all ones that are relevant to the teaching that Ewan's going to explain in just a minute. So the image you've got there is the estuary, which is one of the case studies we use to get our students to think about environmental change, climate change, and the impact of extreme weather on the resilience of communities along the estuary in South Devon. So just to say that I haven't put random nice images of Devon in the presentation. They do serve a purpose. Okay, if you haven't quite finished, keep going as we go through all in the presentation. But I'm going to hand over to Ewan now, who is just going to explain a bit about the general program structure we have at Exeter and the modules that underlie the points that we're going to make later on.
Okay, thanks, Stuart, and thanks a lot to you all for joining, and to Neil for organising. So really, what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of what our particular degree programmes look like at Exeter. Obviously, as you know, geography programmes have a reasonable amount of variability. At Exeter, we have a human geography and a physical geography programme. The ethos that surrounds the first year, which goes for many geography departments in the country, is one of large cohort modules that cover quite a lot of physical and human geography together. So that first year is really about making that transition into higher education as smooth as possible for students, so they not only develop the academic skills that they need, but they also encounter all of the different sort of areas of research that are covered across both physical and human geography, and crucially, the contemporary debates that it's relevant, that geographers are contributing to. So we face this big challenge in the first year of how we cover some of these issues that cut across, as Stuart said, both physical science and the social sciences and humanities. And that's something that we're going to come on to in a minute, and I'm going to give you an example of that particular module. So in the first year, students take, as we've put here, modules from the other side of the discipline. So they have an exposure to both physical and human geography. It's fair to say, though, that many students often feel uncomfortable in doing that. So quite often students will come on to, for example, a physical geography programme with very strong preconceived ideas, quite often about the superiority of physical geography or the superiority of human geography. Others seem more willing to experience both sides of the discipline. But I think Stuart would probably agree, one of the things that we've encountered at the start are quite entrenched views on what physical or human geography sort of stand for. And from our understanding, those views typically evolve through school and through college. And one of the things that we've tried to do in the design of our degree programmes is unpick some of those misconceptions and some of those anxieties around the differences between physical and human geography. So finally, one of the things that's important to say is Exeter, like many other universities, has not just put emphasis on the development of undergraduate programmes, but increasingly on postgraduate programmes as well. So we've just developed an MSc Global Sustainability Solutions, and we'll come back to that later on in thinking about how we can sort of take this momentum, really, which is growing in terms of interdisciplinary interactions beyond undergraduate and into postgraduate as well. So what I'm going to do now is just run through a number of ways in which we've tried to create a sort of pedagogic ground at the nexus of physical and human geography throughout the degree programmes. This is a classic example of a first year module, Geographies of Environment and Sustainability, where we're trying to introduce students to two things. Firstly, we're trying to introduce them to some of the contemporary debates that geographers are making contributions to all over the world. But secondly, and crucially, we're trying to equip students with a range of skills to actually explore these issues critically. And that often involves exposure to the different ways in which physical and human geographers approach different research questions. So as you can see in the description there, this is quite a broad module in that it's dealing with how all of these different aspects of environmental issues come together. So the physical side of things, so for example, the environmental side of the debates, alongside the economic, the social, the political, and the cultural. Now, typically, the feedback from these sorts of modules is that students enjoy it. They enjoy understanding, learning at the sort of nexus of physical and human geography, but they often also find it really challenging because as a module, it's getting at quite a few things. It's challenging students in terms of understanding how physical and social scientists operate in the research landscape, but it's also challenging because it's getting at some of the preconceived and the ideas and some of the misconceptions that many students come into geography programs with. So the feedback has been really, really positive from these sorts of modules. In this sort of module, we cover about 4 or 5 themes, and through those themes, students are introduced to some of these key concepts such as risk, environmental risk that sort of cut across physical and human geography. When we take students into the second year, we have largely modules at Exeter that are either physical geography or human geography. We have several modules that operate at the nexus of both. One of them is called Climate Change, Science and Society. The other one, both Stuart and I run, is called Volatile Planet. And this is a module which is about exploring how physical and human geographers approach the study of natural hazards. So the purpose of Volatile Planet, and as you can see there, is it's an interdisciplinary research module. It's essentially about understanding how we can explore some of these key concepts in natural hazards research, and crucially to see how physical and human geographers come at concepts from very, very different angles. So typically, when you encounter a natural hazards module at university, they can be quite descriptive. So it can be a sort of week 1 volcanoes, week 2 earthquakes, week 3 tsunamis, etc. That can be really, really interesting, but quite often those sorts of modules are quite descriptive. What we try to do here with Volatile Planet is actually step away from just equipping people with how and why a volcano erupts, to trying to think about the ways in which researchers study and understand the key concepts around natural hazards. So, for example, the ways in which physical scientists often think about risk in a heavily quantifiable way. Everything's got to be modelled, etc. Whereas human geographers will think about risk in a very different way. It'll be something that's socially constructed, and these are 2 very, very different ways of exploring the same concept. So in this particular example in Volatile Planet, we take students through these key concepts of risk, vulnerability and resilience, and we try to get them to sort of unpick how these concepts are mobilised in this area of research. One of the important things here, though, that we also do is we try and get students to see how these concepts play out in real world contexts. So we've gone through, it's fair to say, I think Stuart will agree, a lot of experimentation with this module, which is about 7 years old now. We started off with a very sort of classroom-based approach, if you will, where it was largely sort of theoretical. We've moved over the years to one in which we've used the local environment as a lens to explore some of these concepts. So what we try and do on this module is get students to engage with a number of hazards in the local area. The main one that we use is flooding, either along the River Exe or flooding around the Exe estuary, which is just down the road from us here. And we send students out into the environment in groups, and they collect observations. They also do their own research into secondary data and resources, and that acts as the basis for a practical exam. And we found this to be really, really effective. in actually getting students to think about how these concepts actually are used by both academics but also by practitioners. So for example, someone working in the Environment Agency or Devon County Council to study and to manage natural hazards. The other module that students typically engage with at the Nexus is climate change, science and society. In a similar way, this is a module that tries to get students to actually develop a good understanding of the links here between the physical science and the social science. It's very, very different in terms of its structure. We've put a bit of information, I won't go through it here. You can find out more about this sort of module here. This is, again, a very popular module with students because it gets them to think about not just acquiring information, but understanding that knowledge is provisional and contested in nature. So a big part of this module is getting students to debate these contested areas in climate change from both a science and society context. And typically the feedback for this sort of module is very good because it said, students say it sort of makes issues come alive. And that really, I think, is what we're trying to do with these sorts of modules at the Nexus. We're trying to actually take topics which in some cases can be quite dry if you're thinking about the quantification of risk, and we're thinking about how these things play out in a societal context. And then lastly, one of the things that we have developed much more recently is an international field trip, which tries to develop further these ideas that we've started in these second year modules that I've already talked about. The trip itself is designed for human and physical geographers, so it doesn't make really stringent assumptions about the material that students have come across already in their degree. Instead, what we're trying to do here are two things. Firstly, we're trying to introduce students from across the geography sort of spectrum to ways in which researchers try to understand some of these concepts such as risk or vulnerability or resilience within a particular environmental context. So within the Bay of Naples, which has a number of natural hazards. So on this particular trip, whether it's looking at predictions of sea level rise, vulnerability to mud flows in places like Amalfi, the Amalfi Coast, or looking at the threats that are posed by a Vesuvius eruption, what we're trying to do with a range of exercises is introduce students to research methods that they can start to actually use potentially in their own research in the following year when they do their undergraduate dissertation. It's fair to say that we've gone through a bit of experimentation with this module. We've changed various aspects of the trip. One of the things that we've done over the years is place much more emphasis on the independent research component. So half of this trip is very guided. It's based on a series of sort of half-day trips to explore particular environmental contexts and hazards. Then the students take that learning and apply it to their own chosen research case study. So we've had students working in and around the sort of Bay of Naples, some have gone to Capri, and they're trying to actually use their knowledge and understanding that they've gained in the early part of this module to develop a piece of, essentially a small piece of research, a research project that they then present back to the group. So you can find out more as with the other modules on that link. I'm going to hand over to Stuart now. That's a very quick run through of some of the examples of these Nexus modules, and Stuart's going to talk about some of the other key issues.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Ewan. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the kind of setting for what we're going to talk about, which is this kind of, it's kind of a reflection of our own learning journey, really. I suppose if you wanted to get started, if you haven't already, I'm sure there's lots of people on the call who are already doing this stuff and have got lots of valuable insights as well. But if you haven't started yet, for me, I think the most important place, as I've said, is to find someone else to have that conversation with from the other side of the discipline. And there will be those people who, you know, you enjoy having a coffee with when you can, who, you know, you're interested in their research, etc. Actually, finding at least one other person who you think, yes, actually, it would be really interesting to teach a module with that person, because we've got kind of similar interests, but we're coming from a kind of a different epistemological or methodological background. Actually, you know, there are things that we could say that would almost be, you know, more than the sum of the parts, which is what I think the value, hopefully, of lots of these kinds of modules are. And actually, over the years, I've kind of ended up having lots of coffee chats with people that in the end haven't gone anywhere, but they've been interesting in their own right. But some of them have borne fruit. And actually, yes, there are collaborative research projects that emerge, but off of those come these kinds of modules, which are, so I think starting it in an informal way with people that you're comfortable with is a really good way of beginning. And as a result, I think it does have to be about evolution, not revolution, because everybody knows that departments have fairly rigid structures in terms of their programs and their module offerings. And, you know, departments are a bit like oil tankers. You know, if you want to turn on an oil tanker, it will take quite a long time. And actually to rejuvenate and change a program that has hundreds of students on it will take years. So just to give you an idea, you know, I think Volatile Planet, we started a couple of years after we had those conversations. Bay of Naples field trip, as Ewan said, didn't start until 2016, you know, 4 or 5 years after we'd had those conversations, because actually changing field trips and getting the department to say, actually, yes, we will approve a trip that takes human and physical geographers, that takes all kinds of changes in the program specs, which is why it's good to have allies and it's good to have people who you can work with. So having those kind of relationships and beginning to build up a head of steam with a small group of people who can, you know, in a very positive way, lobby your teaching committee, can lobby your head of education, program lead, head of department, I think is really useful. Another thing that's really useful that you would need as that kind of evidential base to begin planning these modules is to get student feedback, which Ewan's talked about, which is, you know, actually saying to students in your tutorials, you know, you can use all sorts of things now like Microsoft Forms. Actually, okay, what would you think about this kind of module that would deal with this kind of issue, but would involve you stepping across the line occasionally, if you're a human geographer doing a bit of physical or vice versa. Generally, those kind of modules are really, really popular because they take students back to a certain extent about what really inspired them to be a geographer from their school or college days. They will learn it, as Ewan has said, in a very different way, because they will often learn it through concepts rather than an individual hazard. But the idea of appreciating geography as a holistic discipline, I think, is very popular. So it can be, you know, I think we've got about 130 on Volatile Planet this coming year, which is, you know, I think is partly because it's the kind of subject that students associate with geography to a certain extent. I do think it is really important to think about the fit within the current program structure. So take a look at your program specifications and say, well, actually, there's a gap here, or actually, we're not teaching those kinds of techniques. Or actually, we don't have any interdisciplinary modules, but actually we say in our admissions material that we are a really kind of integrated discipline, but actually that's not coming through. And showing where those gaps lie to your teaching committee and your director of education and your head of department, actually they're going to be grateful to you for doing that, because, you know, there aren't that many colleagues who necessarily want to do this kind of teaching. So if you are passionate about it, you're probably pushing at an open door. But finding where the gaps are, getting the evidence from student feedback, working in a group, I think is really important. And you'll know other examples of these. Thinking then about that's the first stage. And then thinking about, secondly, okay, let's say we've got this genesis idea, we've got this great idea for a module. You know, we were a physical geographer and a human geographer. We've got an idea to teach at the Nexus that we think is going to be popular with students. It fits with our program. How do we begin writing the module description? How do we begin thinking about what the intended learning outcomes, the ILOs, are going to be? What's the ethos of the module going to be, and what kinds of learning practices will we want to develop? And I think it is really important to put the interdisciplinary nature of the module at the heart of the learning outcomes. In other words, rather than the learning outcomes being really drilled down to be so subject specific that, you know, this module is about learning about hazards, actually, you could say this module is about engaging students to be able to appreciate learning from different disciplinary perspectives or subdisciplinary perspectives. And one of the ways we've found to do this, is only one way, and you may have better or alternative ways, is we've tended to hang these modules off hooks. So Volatile Planet has 3 hooks, which is risk, resilience and vulnerability, which we teach as a human and a physical geographer. And we make a point of saying, well, actually, there are some key epistemological differences in how physical scientists and social scientists conceptualize risk. But actually, if you are a risk manager and you're working on the estuary at a time of climate change, you will need to be able to articulate both of those. And that's what we try and do in the practical assessment for that module. One of the ways we've probably managed to find to get students to engage with that kind of learning is to build into the assessment, either formative or summative, a reflective component, because we do recognise that actually this is quite difficult for some students. So, for example, on the Bay of Naples field trip, the fieldwork notebook, a reflective notebook of the individual student's learning, is, I think, 40% of the assessment. Because we recognise that actually these things can be tough, and we want students to recognise when they've found something difficult, but also when they've found something that's been rewarding to them and how they've overcome some of those challenges. I think we can also build interdisciplinary skills into those kind of transferable ILOs, thinking about, you know, employability skills, working in a group, listening, appreciating someone else's perspective, being able to see a problem from a holistic point of view. If appropriate, you know, for example, in the assessment for climate change, science and society that Ewan discussed, the students have to do a debate, and they are pitched against another team. And actually, one of the key skills that students need to learn is they have to be able to negotiate with their team what their debating argument is going to be. And actually that can be really difficult because they're frequently having to argue against what they believe themselves. Developing a module ethos, and I think that it sounds a bit glib the way I've written it here, and it's not meant to be, but actually what we try to do is to say, yes, we're going to talk to you about the differences that exist intellectually between a physical science and an arts, humanities, social science approach to this problem. But we're going to try and frame those in a positive way to try and understand how we might, if appropriate, fuse them together, or at least recognise the value in both. Because as Ewan said, there can be a tendency from some students to believe, for example, that quantification is the most valuable way to approach a problem. So if it can't be quantified, it's not worth worrying about. And likewise, there will be other students who reject quantification completely and believe that it has no value. And our role, I think, is to show students that, well, actually, quantification in the published literature has a role. It may not be the answer to everything, but it will be an answer, and we need to see the problem through that perspective and alternative perspectives. And then the final one is, we'll touch on this towards the end as well, is about accessibility. I think that's one of the things we've learned a huge amount about, is actually, okay, well, if a physical geographer chooses to take Volatile Planet, they may struggle with elements of the module which are trying to get them to use social theory to form an argument in an essay. So how can we engage them and teach social theory in a way that we might not teach it to just a human geography audience. And I think that requires a lot more scaffolding for students than you might have in a kind of standard human geography option, where you might assume that everybody is very familiar with social theory in human geography. And then in designing the actual structure and the design principles, the kind of week-to-week rhythm of the module, which I'm sure everybody on this call, it's all been thrown up in the air anyway this year, because we're all teaching online or blended. And so this is something that is a little bit fluid for all of us at the moment. But I do think in these modules, the key signifier for me in these modules is that the pace has to be different. It has to be slower, and there has to be a much clearer sense of a learning journey, which allows students to learn at perhaps more elongated paces than may be the case in a module which is only focused at physical or human geography students. So reflective learning, again, as I've said before, which enables students to get credit for actually finding stuff really difficult and explaining why that is the case. So, for example, on the Bay of Naples field trip, we try to set up a learning journey for the students that actually lasts a whole term. It'll last a whole 12 weeks, where we have very structured incremental activities where we set particular goals for the end of each week, where students will be able to say, well, by the end of that week, we need to have written a short proposal. We need to have read this amount of material. We need to have had a group debate about what our small project aims are going to be. And actually checking in with students frequently through using things like formative assessment, as well as relying on summative assessment. I do really think that these modules lend themselves to peer learning in the form of group work, which I've mentioned before. Many of our students, I think, see group work as a problem if it's assessed, because they believe somehow that their assessment marks will be, this is their perception, will be dragged down by students who they may believe to be weaker. What we're trying to emphasize to students here is actually, we deliberately mix you up into students who are from physical geography and human geography. And actually what we are assessing is the learning journey rather than a particular output. There is an output which we will read, but actually it will be supported by a reflective commentary, for example, and a presentation on this particular field trip, the Bay of Naples field trip, where we explicitly ask students to talk about how they've managed the negotiation of doing this project. And the reason we do that is, of course, that outside of academia, if you work for the Environment Agency, you may well have to actually negotiate with climate scientists and with a social scientist, and you need to be able to think about what the skills are that you require. So our key message, I think, is slowing down and allowing time for checking in, and allowing enough assessment weighting for reflective learning that actually is assessing learning rather than kind of facts and the ability to repeat facts. Yeah, and so I'll hand back to Ewan, who's just going to talk about group working, which is something I think we're thinking about a lot at Exeter at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So one of the big challenges of a module like this is that you've got people who maybe are more comfortable with, as we've put at the top here, working in a more of a scientific context, and those that might be more comfortable in the social sciences or humanities. So we've, over the years, sort of tried to think quite carefully about how you can optimize, how you can make as accessible as effective those small group working activities. And we've got a list of points here. I'll just run through each one. The first one about recognizing that role of dominant voices. It's quite often the case that in a group you will have obviously a range of personalities. You will have a range of confidences of those participants. And one of the things that we noticed at quite an early stage, particularly on Volatile Planet, was that it was quite common for some students to sit there and say absolutely nothing throughout an entire lecture, which was broken up with discussion sessions. And so one of the ways around that is by setting tasks where individuals are encouraged to look at different elements of a particular research problem or challenge. And so each person is encouraged to contribute different elements to a debate. And that's been very, very effective. One of the things that we've already touched upon is this idea of different epistemologies, different ways of sort of seeing the world and approaching research problems. And actually that process of working in small groups and having to negotiate why knowledges are constructed in different ways by different actors, physical scientists or social scientists, is we found to be really, really effective. And largely by the end of the module, people do seem to be more appreciative of the different ways of generating knowledge within natural hazards research. Secondly, setting tasks that are accessible to all, but also stimulate, stimulate debate. One of the things that we found, and I was particularly guilty of this early on, was I realised I was setting tasks that were much more accessible to physical geographers. That was my background. And looking back, I'm actually quite horrified at what I did, because when you think about it, it wasn't a particularly useful learning exercise for the sort of half of the room that were more comfortable in human geography. I think it's useful to be aware of this, but don't worry if things go wrong. So by all means, experiment with these sort of different balances, these different approaches to trying to make small group working as accessible as possible. But it's only often by making those mistakes that we learn. So don't be put off if something goes wrong first time. Then ensuring that staff, so people like Stuart and myself, provide additional support. One of the things that there's a great danger of here is students going through a module and silently worrying about everything. I mean, one of the ways around this is to encourage students to use office hours, but it's also about encouraging students to come forward with questions that they might think are stupid. It's that age-old adage, stupid questions sort of thing. In many ways, though, what we've tried to do throughout this module is get students to ask those questions that they may think might be stupid, and in doing so, you often find that you can overcome quite significant hurdles in learning with relative ease. A good example of this was last year when I had a student who came to me who'd read Deborah Lupton's book on risk, and they were a physical scientist. And it must have taken a huge amount of courage, but they said, look, I read this first chapter and I really didn't understand any of it. And I was able to go through and talk them through that particular chapter, and that enabled them to actually learn effectively for the rest of the module. It does take a lot of courage for students to do that, but trying to create an environment where students can do that more comfortably is something that we've tried to do. Then penultimately, there, talking openly to students about resolving conflict and negotiating. Quite often, students will come into a particular context having never had to experience, as Stuart said before, never having to experience conflict resolution and never really having to negotiate things. So if you can set up with students on your modules tasks where they're forced to negotiate and they're forced to actually recognise different ways of knowing about particular environmental issues, we would encourage you to do that. And then lastly, reflection on that group process. most students find that by the end of a lot of these modules, be it our Bay of Naples field trip or Volatile Planet, that they've gained something from reflecting on the learning process. Some students don't. So I had one student who was very honest once and said, well, this has done nothing for me. You won't get around that. I admired their honesty, but most students seem to gain something from reflecting on that learning process. So this will depend in terms of how you actually set up a particular learning exercise. But these are some of the things that we've probably taken from working on Volatile Planet and the field trip module over recent years. So I'll hand back to Stuart now.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. So this is the last slide we've got. So I'm conscious we're going to have questions that hopefully are in the chat. So very briefly, just assessments and supporting students. I think we've probably emphasised this. It's about balancing risks as students see them. And the more that the assessment can reflect the fact that students will see, as Ewan has said, this as being a little bit of a risk for them to take a module like this, I think that's useful. And that can be done, for example, by maximising choice. For example, on the Bay of Naples field trip, we give students lots of choice about the topics that they could focus their research project on, so that we're not forcing them into something that they would feel uncomfortable with. Reflective learning we've already talked about. Practical assessments, an example of our practical assessment for Volatile Planet for this year, which is looking at flooding on the River Exe in the city of Exeter. Getting students in that particular case to do a role play as a way of thinking about how an environment agency or local authority emergency flood planner would tackle a particular issue, and drawing in their knowledge from physical and human geography in order to do that. And again, the use of group assessment. So that's what we wanted to say. I thought, Ali, if it's okay, we had 3 questions submitted early that Neil sent to us, and I wondered if we could just respond to those very quickly, if that's okay.
Yeah, would you like to do those before the opportunities and challenges?
Is that okay? Because I think they follow on reasonably well. So for a very brief, I'll let Ewan read a couple of them and I'll do the first one so he can respond to one of the others. Can it become a third pillar? So that is a really good question. And I think it depends on the departmental culture, because I think it is very popular. But it's probably going to be a third pillar that is going to recruit in a more modest way than a standard BA or BSc degree. So an example, our colleagues in Penryn, they do a BA/BSc geography, where there is a big environment focus which unites the two, and then students are awarded their BA or BSc in the final year, depending on their final year option choices. So it's very different to the Exeter-based campus, because we tend to do physical BSc, human BA. In a sense, students have a bit more sense of identity from the beginning. So there are models that you could use. Be happy to talk about that offline if you like. Do you want to do the second one?
Yes, yeah, thanks. So has teaching and research geography become too negative in predominantly considering environmental harms? And can this risk alienating or disempowering students? If so, how can it become more positive while still retaining realism about the challenges that societies face? Very good question. So I actually agree with this. I think there's a great danger in presenting the doom and gloom that's sort of omnipresent in many areas of sort of environmental geography. And one of the ways I think we can challenge that is about thinking firstly of the fact that all of these contemporary debates don't all have negative elements. There are some, amazing ways in which geographers have and will continue to contribute to environmental issues. They don't always have to be framed in that negative context. One good example of that is, whilst there's a huge amount of sort of eco-anxiety around climate change and associated issues, there are also a number of fantastic opportunities for geographers to actually deal with these issues. A nice one is thinking about how we design better places to live, how we actually think about changing our infrastructures, and that can be everything from sort of transport and mobility, creating spaces for our well-being, just designing better places to live, not these vast estates that rely solely on use of the car, for example. Secondly, I think it's also about recognizing that there are some really exciting areas of geography that are emerging. So areas that are still quite small, like critical physical geography, that seeks to draw on those strands in social science and physical science, and to create a whole new way of actually approaching a research problem. So if you read papers by people like Mark Tadaki or Stuart Lane, they've written on this, or Rebecca Lave, some really, really interesting, but still quite sort of small scale research that shows just what a contribution geography can make. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a look at that literature, it certainly can't be applied to all areas of geography, but there's some really exciting debates going on in that area of critical physical geography.
Yeah, and that's something, just to say that I know you actually teach in the first year. We have a module called Concepts in Geography, and that's something that's taught on that module. The final one, this big issue that I bet a lot of us face, which is a student who's doing a BSc dissertation and they want to do a bit of human geography research as part of that, or vice versa. This is something, certainly from our perspective, that crops up every year. I think three things, because I know we need to get to the kind of the next bit of the seminar. Three things I would say is, firstly, I think it depends on how comfortable the supervisor is and the extent to which there's an ability either to gain feedback and support from, say, a human geographer, if it's a BSc student, and a physical geographer supervisor. I think that's critical, because I don't think we can be expected to kind of supervise completely beyond our abilities and training. Secondly, I think it also depends on the student's kind of research training, and there will be different cultures that exist in different departments about the extent to which students have engaged with methods from the other side of the discipline. And then thirdly, I think that connects to ethics and the extent to which you know, one would be comfortable that a student who's had limited training, for example, in social surveys, would be kind of ethically prepared to go and undertake that research in a way that would be appropriate. So I think it's a bit of a problem for many of us, in a sense that I think it can happen really well, but it kind of requires other colleagues to come in alongside and support you. If you're not personally comfortable, it would be like me trying to supervise a dissertation on tree rings. I know what a tree is, but I don't know any more than that. And so I kind of would want my colleague Ewan, who's a dendrochronologist, to be able to help me. So anyway, I'll hand back to Ali anyway.
Yes, so would you like the opportunities and challenges listed?
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, thanks.
So in terms of opportunities, so we've got the opportunity to demonstrate that humans have impact on the environment, and the environment has impact on human development and behaviour. Another one, to make a fuller sense and understanding of the people and world around us, leading to wiser decision making. And they put a challenge there as well, getting students and colleagues to think outside their silos, which I think is a really common one. Yeah. Opportunity, wider resonance with students, and again, challenge competing with ontological and I can never say the word, epistemological perspectives. Another opportunity, multidisciplinary approaches to problems, and challenge communicating that approach to students. Another challenge here that's not come up before is the complexity of getting some of these issues across as well, which I think is a really big one. And another challenge here, how to separate human and natural impacts, e.g. changing climate and weather.
Oh, yeah, that's
Got
yeah.
a couple more. I won't go through them all because some of them are similar to each other. Oh, here's a good one. Challenge, curriculum constantly changing. Lack of strong tradition of environmental geography falling between the cracks.
Yeah.
And a key opportunity someone's put to fully address the Sustainable Development Goal key challenges, breaking disciplinary silos, dealing with complex systems.
Yeah.
I think they're the kind of main ones. Some of them are very similar questions. Another challenge is language as well, which I think is something that's quite common across the board.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting on the opportunities that I really like the impact one. And I think that can be manifested in all sorts of different ways. I mean, we haven't talked at all about development geography in the way that that might be taught in an interdisciplinary context, particularly if you're talking about climate change adaptation, for example. That's somewhere where you could talk to students a great deal about that. The other thing I really like, sense of understanding, and I've written down here empathy, because I think actually that is something that we've never actually talked about it actually, but I think it's something that we'd like to permeate what we do, because actually being able to have empathy both with other learners, but also different communities globally about the challenges that they face, I think is really interesting. And then the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, again, that's probably a really good way of perhaps unifying some of the things that we're trying to do. Yeah.
And I like the one of the latter points really, which is about language, and this is something that I think I really struggled with in a teaching sense, because on our module Volatile Planet, there are some areas of hazard research, as you get with all areas of research, where you get authors who can write in a very accessible way, and they make, if you can pick out a couple of resources, that can make the difference between someone looking at you in a bewildered way and students coming into a lecture having read something thinking, oh yes, I could grasp that, and I feel I can use that as a foundation for my learning. One of the big problems that we face in a module like Volatile Planet is, understandably, quite a lot of those research articles contain impenetrable language, terminology that you're sort of constantly having to look up. So one of the big challenges that we've come across, particularly when trying to actually use physical science papers, journal articles in particular, is trying to find articles that are useful as a sort of lens that you can use to explain something to students, that you can use to illustrate a particular research problem, but that have a degree of accessibility. And I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. If you can find authors that write in an accessible way, I typically sort of try and use those as key journal articles or key book chapters on these modules. But I think that's definitely an important challenge.
Yeah.
Okay, if I jump in now, guys. So I've got a quick question as well, which I think follows on from some of the challenges that Ali mentioned about. So it was one I thought of myself, and also maybe one or two comments. So in designing and teaching on an interdisciplinary module, one of the challenges, it seems to me, is like staff themselves actually tend to be quite specialized in the knowledge that they have. You think about myself, for example, I actually specialized in human geography in my undergraduate degree. And I kind of wish I didn't now, because sometimes in teaching, I wish that I had more of that physical geography background. So, I mean, I guess for you guys in teaching this module, the question is that a challenge that you encountered, and how did you sort of deal with it? Was for example, you, Stuart, did you kind of go out and say, I'm going to learn some physical geography sit down and read, or is it a case of I'll leave that to you and then I'll just teach on my bit? And does that, if it's that approach, does that create problems in terms of, you know, module coherence and stuff like that? So yeah, I'd just be interested to hear your reflection.
Yeah.
Well, first if I start, I mean, so I think firstly, we tried to take the view that for most of the majority of the teaching sessions, I think this is actually quite an important point. We're in the room together. Now, you know, we're very rarely both at the front, or we are when we're kind of chairing a student discussion, but very often the 2-hour slots in kind of pre-COVID days would be, you know, I would do the first 30 minutes, then Ewan would do 20 minutes, then I'd do the next 30, and we chair the discussions together. So I suppose actually saying to the students, we're here together, we're not paying lip service to this, we're both putting in the effort, and we're actually, you know, so I have felt less the need to actually try and learn the physical science, but actually more to have a presence, and also through actually sitting through what Ewan will say over the last 7 years now. But it's, of course, I have begun to absorb some of this stuff, and I feel more competent with it. So, because I agree with you, Neil, that there is a danger that a colleague might think, well, I can't, you know, I'm not going to be able to master this, so I can't teach on the module. But I think there are subtle ways that you can kind of say, actually, you know, we're trying, and we don't have to be the expert. But of course, Ewan has crossed the floor much more than I have, you know, on this, in the sense that you, as a physical scientist, you've actually, I think, to be fair, engaged a bit more in the human geography.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm not going to give you my life's history, but I started off as very much a physical geographer. So my PhD is in dendroclimatology, so using tree rings, you know, lots of chemistry to reconstruct past climate. It was only when I came to Exeter and realised I wanted to move away from that area. I still wanted to keep the sort of climate change theme. But I'll be completely honest, I wanted a permanent lectureship. And the only way I could do that was by changing what I did. And it was a chance conversation after a human geography research seminar that I'd been to in the pub down the road here with Stuart, that we decided to organise a seminar on climate change communication. And it was only at that point, and a bit of teaching in the first year, you know, new lecturer, you get everything dumped on you, you're trying to keep sort of one page ahead of the students. I had to teach all of these different areas, as many of us do, and you realise that actually you can do things, you can learn, you know, about new things, and lecture eventually with confidence on these issues. So over the years, really over the last 7 years, I've learned a huge amount from Stuart, who's obviously a human geographer by training, and have developed that understanding. And it's completely different from the area that I initially trained in. So my advice would be, if you feel that you can't be a physical or a human geographer, and you think, oh, I don't do that sort of thing at all, give it a go, because in time, it will be fine.
Thank you.
We have had another question come in. Apologies, I had to move locations in case seem a bit different. But so we've had a question. So it's saying highlighting the different perspectives and understandings is really interesting. In the course of the modules, do students also explore commonalities, ways of bringing both perspectives together to study complex issues such as climate change?
Yeah, so for example, on Volatile Planet, we start off the module by showing students that physical and human geographers often have very, very different ways of coming at these concepts of risk, vulnerability, and resilience. It's not really until that sort of latter part of the module where we start to explore some of those commonalities and some of the research that we've done in the local area on co-producing flood risk knowledges, for example, and sort of radical scientific method, where we start to show students that actually there are really interesting and emerging ways that you can address some of these environmental issues that don't sit traditionally within sort of physical or human geography, but instead are not necessarily about solving an environmental problem, but they're about creating a better understanding within a particular community. So for example, a community that's been hit by flooding, and it's about creating a negotiated set of knowledges which can form a basis for a community addressing a particular problem. So I think, yes, we do start to explore some of those commonalities, but also I think we're quite honest with students about entrenched thinking that still exists, some of the big barriers that you can come across. And the aim is to really sort of allow students to develop some of those skills that we talked about earlier in negotiating, but also accepting that there are different ways of understanding the world.
And I think just to in Follows Our Planet, the last session, as Ewan said, is we look at the literature on knowledge co-production, and I think one way of getting that, enabling students to look at these different perspectives, is to take a very simple example, which goes back to my point about doing things slower. We might ask the students a question about, okay, we've been talking about river flooding and surface water flooding. How do we know what the risks are, we might say to the students? And you know, the traditional answer would be, well, we look up on the Environment Agency website and we see their flood map for a 1 in 100-year flood. Yes, that's fine. That is a quantifiable model-based approach, which is using traditional scientific methods, which is important. But through the research that we've kind of done on this, we could say, but you might also know about how the river behaves because you've lived in a house for 50 years next to the river, and you have important knowledge which has a value, which can sit alongside and work with traditional scientific data. But to get value from that, you will need a different perspective. But they're both trying to address the same question. So probably simplicity is the key. And actually saying, well, yes, we can see the problem of flooding through a number of different lenses, but those lenses all have value. As Ewan has said, not everybody will see the value in all of those. So I think what we're trying to do is a little bit kind of on the edge in that sense, and we have to take students on a journey, I think, there. But I think there are ways of doing it very simply. Because we are dealing with quite complex concepts, you can just drill it down to a very simple question, which is, what do we know about this river and how it behaves? Well, we know about it in different ways. Yeah.
Interesting. That's really good. I've got one more question, guys. Sorry to jump in again. I just wanted to ask, I was really interested to hear when you talked about the types of assessment you use on these modules, and kind of trying to focus more on these sorts of reflective learning pieces where students are kind of encouraged. Well, I guess you said the focus is more on learning than on kind of repeating facts. But I guess, again, it's kind of a practical question. I'm just sort of interested in knowing, on what basis do you assess that? Like, how do you assess what is a good reflective learning piece?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, so that's an excellent question. I think it is a real challenge, because different students, particularly on their training as to whether they're physical or human geographers, in my experience, have different ways of articulating you know, what they've struggled with or find easier. And I think that the thing that I found challenging as a member of staff, often marking these reflective pieces, is trying to unpick the degree to which the student has been able to reflect critically. I think that's the key. How has the student been able to actually engage with their learning journey? So, for example, on our Bay of Naples field trips, you'll get a lot of students that will say, you know, I find this activity challenged me because. I mean, that in itself is a really nice example of someone who's entering in to that critical thinking, because you will get occasionally comments from students that say, yeah, I enjoyed this. Okay, and it might be something that's, you know, great to hear, but might be a bit more descriptive. But the one thing that I find is that you have to, as a marker, be very, very careful with these sorts of assessments, that you don't discriminate against the sort of learning experiences that students on the physical or the human side have had. Human geographers, in my experience, you know, they deal with these sorts of areas in assessments much more often, sort of reflection. I think it's fair to say they're often equipped with better writing skills when it comes to that kind of assessment. Physical geographers more than capable of doing it, but will often write those sorts of responses in a slightly different way, in my experience. So I think understanding that, and it will often take a bit of time to understand that when you're going through assessments, is important.
And I think one of the things I struggle in the same way, and what we were going to do on our field trip in March, which never happened, was something that had been experimented with the previous term in one of our research training modules, which had a reflective learning component. And what the module leader did there was he made it very structured. So he said, you're going to write 200 words on what you found difficult, and you're going to write 200 more words on why that was difficult, and 200 more words on what you have learnt from that experience and how you think it's useful. And actually I thought, oh yes, that actually really helps the student, and it really helped us. So I think if you can work out, well, actually, what are the learning outcomes we want, and can we actually make those in a very practical, mundane sense actually word limited things that we really guide the students towards? Because I think I've been very guilty in the past saying to students, you're going to do a fieldwork notebook, hey, it's great, and I've not really said what does a fieldwork notebook involve. And so I think you're right, we've been on a bit of a journey with that one as well. But I think breaking it down into really clear criteria about the what, the how, the why, the what for, might be one way of thinking of doing that, to give students that credit. And it might, as you say, it might help students who find doing that more difficult.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you very much. We're about coming to time now. We've covered all the main questions that have come in through the chat. We've had a few thank you messages as well, and thank you for a very
thank you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Webinar. I suppose, Neil, do you want to just mention about our AGM next week and the other activities?
Yes, I can do. Yeah, and also thanks as well to Stuart and Ewan again, because that was super interesting and really, really useful as well. So I'll stop the recording now.